Good morning. Thank you all for being here, despite the snow and rain and wind and everything else outside. You really had to want to be here today to be here, and we appreciate it. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly Magazine and the Vice President of Policy for America's Society and Council of the Americas. Few people realized it at the time, but 2014 was a historic year for Latin America. On March 17th of that year, we saw a police raid of a money laundering operation out of a gas station in Brasilia. This simple event would turn into one of the biggest corruption scandals ever detected anywhere in the world, the car wash scandal. To date, the investigations and the prosecutions are still ongoing. We've seen dozens of people jailed and billions of dollars worth of fines. The tentacles have since spread into Colombia, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and beyond, and they still continue to this day. But this is not just a story of Lava Jato, of the car wash probe, because later in 2014, in November, we saw the eruption of the so-called Casa Blanca scandal, the White House scandal, in Mexico, the product of investigative journalism. This was a case that had immediate and enduring consequences for the popularity of President Enrique Peña Nieto, who later conceded that he had made a mistake. 2014 also saw the beginnings of several corruption scandals in Chile, including one involving the son of President Michelle Bachelet. He was accused of using his influence to get a large bank loan for his wife. And 2014 was also the year that the CICIG, a UN-affiliated organization in Guatemala, began gathering evidence for a case involving fraud at the customs agency. This amazing case produced concrete proof of wrongdoing all the way to the upper echelons of Guatemalan government. First, the vice president was jailed. Then Congress stripped the stripped the president of his immunity from prosecution as tens of thousands of demonstrators outside peacefully demanded justice. The president, who you see here, Otto Perez Molina, resigned and was then jailed the next day. Well, as they say in journalism, which is my profession, 3 is a trend. And there's way more than 3 countries at work here. So the question is, why did all these things happen more or less at the same time? Now, it doesn't seem, we don't know for sure, but those of us who follow this for a living, it seems that corruption in Latin America is no worse than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 50 years ago. Instead, experts and analysts and some of the people who are here today tend to focus on 4 main factors. One is democracy. At the dawn of the 1980s, only 3 Latin American countries were full democracies. And today, following the democratizing wave that came with the end of the Cold War, there are only 2 dictatorships left in the region, Cuba and Venezuela. This has allowed judicial institutions and investigative journalism to mature and become more independent. The group of prosecutors leading car wash is primarily in their 30s and 40s. Judge Sergio Moro, who's with us today, is only 45 years old. I just turned 40, so I like to think that 45 is young. But 45 is young. And his is a generation that grew up under democracy. Now, this is a story that has been repeated to varying degrees elsewhere in the region. And as we look at this wave of prosecutions, it's no coincidence that this is all happening 1 full generation after democracy returned to Latin America. The second factor behind all of these cases seems to be the rise of the middle class. Thanks to the commodities boom and smart fiscal policies in the 2000s, 50 million Latin Americans have come out of poverty and into the middle class since 2003, according to the World Bank. And as people move into the middle class, their values change and their interests change. If you look, for example, at the case of Brazil, back in 2003, the primary concerns were unemployment, violence, and hunger. But if you look at 2016, corruption suddenly appears on the radar as the #1 concern. This is because people's day-to-day needs were being met more frequently. Many of them were paying taxes when they weren't paying taxes before, and so they became more concerned about where their money was going. These values changed. And lest anyone think that this is a Brazilian phenomenon, let me talk to you about another poll. If you look at the region as a whole, corruption now appears third on the agenda in Latin America, behind only the economy and crime. That's according to the Latino Barometro, which does a very respected, large annual survey. The percentage of Latin Americans who see corruption as their country's most pressing problem has nearly tripled since 2010, according to, again, Latino Barometro. Corruption is seen as the #1 issue, not just in Brazil, but in Colombia, and it's #2 in Peru and Mexico. The third reason for this change, for all this wave of cases, is the rise of social media, which has allowed news of corruption to travel more quickly and for protesters to organize themselves. This was the case with CICIG, with the Casablanca scandal in Mexico as well. Before, perhaps, government officials and business elites, to some extent, were able to play down or suppress news of corruption, no longer. And then finally, there have been technological and new legal changes as well. Of course, what's happening with corruption in Latin America, it's not just happening in the region. In just the last month, the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, resigned under a wave of corruption accusations, and police also said they would recommend charges against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There have also been changes such as banking secrecy laws that changed after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Developments like the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act have also been key. But look, if you look at this in a global context, Latin America is really the most dramatic front in this global battle against corruption. Now, we at America's Quarterly have been writing about this since early 2016 when we put together this cover, which got a lot of attention at the time, and we're very proud that we have all three of those people on the cover together for the first time today. The bottom line is that this, like so much else that's been happening in Latin America over the last 25 years, is a story of progress. This anti-corruption wave is the product of positive changes in the region and in the world, and the potential benefits are huge. There have been vast differences in the degree of success. Some countries have lagged behind. But everywhere there are signs of hope, and there are signs that change is already occurring. Latin America is the world's most unequal region. And if corruption substantially declines, inequality will decline also. There will be more resources for education, for healthcare, and for infrastructure. There will be a more level playing field for companies, local and foreign. This emphasis on corruption also has the potential to remake the region's political landscape. 2 out of 3 Latin Americans will elect a new president in 2018. And right now, candidates that have made corruption their #1 rallying cry are first in the polls in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. So as we stand here at the beginning of 2018, many of us are convinced that this is more than just a trend. This is more than just a moment. This is a movement. It's an anti-corruption movement in Latin America. It's one of those moments where social values change, where practices that were acceptable before no longer are. Similar, perhaps, in some ways to the civil rights movement, or Me Too, or the move against the robber barons in this country a century ago. It's a movement that has the potential to forever change the calculus of actors in both the private and public sector, and to transform the region for the better. But, and here's the question we want to ask today. What if we're wrong? What if this is just a passing phase? What if politicians and other defenders of the status quo succeed in rolling back the changes that have made Car Wash, La Linea, and other investigations possible? What if Latin Americans were actually more angry about the down economy in recent years, and that once economies pick back up, as they're generally expected to in 2018, the anger over corruption fades? What if the anti-corruption movement collapses under accusations of political bias, selective justice, and lack of due process? It's happened before. After all, Alberto Fujimori ran in 1989 as an anti-corruption, anti-establishment candidate. So did Fernando Collor. Both, of course, would resign after scandals of their own. And the most famous case is mani pulite. This, of course, was the case that back in Italy in the early 90s purged hundreds of people from the political system. And yet, nearly 30 years, the perception in Italy, nearly 30 years later, the perception in Italy is that very little actually changed. So what if this whole thing just ends up like mani pulite? Well, that's what we're going to debate today. How to ensure that the progress of recent years is consolidated and expanded even further. What reforms are necessary in order to make judges and prosecutors more effective? What changes does the private sector need to make? Have there been excesses? What changes do actors in the judicial sector need to make to avoid selective justice or the perception thereof? And is there a way to pursue corruption cases while also avoiding unnecessary damage for the economy? We have 10 extraordinary speakers who are here today to help us answer some of those questions. There have been other conferences similar to this one, but we think we have 2 points that are setting us apart today. One is that we're truly regional, and 2 is that we have substantial presence of the private sector here in the room today. So thank you all for being here. We're not here today to put anyone on a pedestal. And I have warned our speakers that we will ask them tough questions, both from the moderators and from the audience. I've also asked them to be frank and direct. There will be no taboos. A few programming notes before we start. You'll hear 3 languages today: English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So if you don't have all 3, please make sure that you have the little apparatuses that are either outside, and we can pass some around if you didn't grab them on your way in. Another note, we managed to bring together from all corners of the region a fabulous group. We're very proud of them. But some of you may have noticed there is a gender imbalance. We tried to do better, we weren't able to, and we regret that. Lots of people made this event possible today. My team, Alana Tumino, Leani Garcia, thank you for all your hard work. Susan Siegel, wherever you are, thank you for believing this initiative. Hi, Susan. Thank you for believing in this from the very beginning. And I'd also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Ford Foundation, the International Institute of Education, and the Open Society Foundations for making all of this possible. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Judge Sergio Moro to join me here on the stage. Thank you. That one over there. I want to ask you about mani pulite, because you have studied that going back years, and I want to ask you about some of those possible parallels that I just drew. But before I do, I want to ask, basically, how did we get here? And this extraordinary process that started almost exactly 4 years ago. If you think back, what was the one change that made the car wash case possible? Was it the Constitution of 1988? Was it plea bargain laws? What was it that suddenly created this climate, or was it so sudden, where a case like that was possible?
Well, first, good morning for everybody. I'm grateful to be here and to receive this invitation. I don't have an answer about your question. I think there is no such one thing that was the cause of this investigation or this movement. I think, Brazil got his new constitution on 1988, redemocratization. And in time, I think the institution become stronger, and also we have a more demanding democracy. And I think all that happened, it was a kind of a mixed result of a demanding more democracy, stronger institutions, a wish for a stronger democracy, a stronger economy. There is no one main reason, I think.
Let's talk about Manipulite. You've studied that case in detail. Can you explain to us why, again, this idea that what's happening right now will not end just like that did?
I have the great honor and pleasure to meet last year some of the prosecutors and judges who worked, and I was very happy because they are all a little bit old but alive. that is the first point. But well, the history is open. We cannot be sure about what will happen in our countries in the next years. I think Manipulite gave us an important lesson to overcome widespread corruption. It's absolutely necessary that you break impunity. The judicial system must work so that ones who are guilty of bribery or money laundering, they need an answer from our institutions, and the answer usually for this kind of serious crimes is prison. But however, the judicial process, maybe it's not enough to overcome widespread corruption. You need more general reforms from the government. And when you have government not so friendly, things tend to be more difficult. But it's hard to say, hard to know what would be Italy today without Manipulite. Maybe it would be worse. Mm-hmm. You cannot take out of history Manipulite. So in certain ways, it is some of the expectations that they have at that time. This expectation did not realize entirely, but I really believe that Italy is much better now because, let me put in a different way, I think Italy would be even worse now without Manipulite in the past.
You talked a little bit about the resistance that the Italian establishment was able to mount over time. And it's hard to avoid the perception right now that we're seeing a similar reaction in Brazil. I often feel like if this was the Star Wars trilogy, we'd be right in the middle of The Empire Strikes Back right now. Yeah. And I'm not the only, I mean, you know, one of the Supreme Court justices, Barroso, has talked about a pact of the oligarchy to try to resist. I mean, do you see signs of that? Are you worried about it?
We always have risks of setbacks. We are talking about power, about politics, and people struggle for power, and there are people who don't want to change. They want to remain in power, they want their privilege, even if this privilege means that you don't have rule of law and you have impunity for these crimes. So there will be always a risk of setbacks. What we need to do is try to avoid these setbacks. We have to continue to do our work. And I think as citizens, we could never give up. Okay, we are trying to build a better country, a better place to us and for our children. And I think this demands a stronger rule of law and democracy without impunity as a rule for this kind of crime. In Brazil, maybe we could say so far so good. Despite of signs of setback, I don't think that until now the ones who are against this break of impunity were able to do anything much too significant about this. Of course, there have been some setbacks, but I think we still have the tools to go ahead. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in next year and next months will suffer major setbacks. The future is open, but as I said, we will never give up as judges, prosecutors, police officers, citizens, people who really believe in democracy.
So today and in other public forums, you cannot talk about current cases that you're seeing. So I'm not going to ask you about certain politicians. But when you look at the car wash operation as a whole, are we close to the end? I mean, you've talked about this before. You said last year that you thought that the investigative phase of the case would mostly wind down by the end of 2017. But here we are, 2018, actions continue, not just against specific politicians. And there are also sealed indictments of some executives that may continue to play out over time. So, I mean, can we expect, is this phase of the case at least close to ending, or do you keep finding new stuff?
It depends on you think about Lava Jato operation. Its core is about bribes in Petrobras contracts. Okay. Thinking about its core, I think the most part of the work has been done, at least in my court. And an important part of this case is in the hands of the Supreme Court, who has original jurisdiction over criminal charges against some high politicians who...
Just to explain to sort of non-Brazilians in the audience, people who are in elected office tend to have this special privilege, foro privilegiado, which means that the Supreme Court is the only body that can try them for crimes.
Exactly. And if you think in this part of the case, there's still much to be done, because there are some criminal charges. I don't know exactly the number, but they have not been tried yet in the Supreme Court, and probably there are investigations going on the Supreme Court. And in my part of the case, I think the most part, the people without this stand privilege, bribe payers, professional money launderings, and politicians who lost their mandate during the case. And of course, executives of Petrobras, I think the most part of them have been already tried. Of course, I have some other case. But if you think in general terms about this break of the rule of impunity, nowadays you have a lot of important cases in other courts. Rio de Janeiro, you have also in Brasilia. Some of these cases are part of Lava Jato in its origin. Some parts of this case are really new cases. So maybe you have now a lot of criminal cases being persecuted and tried in other courts with this new spirit, okay, that you have to break impunity, of course, using due process of law. But I'll not call all these cases Lava Jato cases.
Okay.
So if you're thinking in the general picture, of course, corruption will continue. It will appear new cases, and the courts will have work for the rest of its times.
Well, so on that note, let me ask you a question that I received from a friend from the private sector who's in attendance here today. And this is one person's question, but it's a question that I hear all the time, and people usually ask me first. They say, "We're off the record, right?" Okay, but let me read this, because I think it's well phrased, and again, I know it's a common question. Is there such a thing as enough is enough? It has been great that this corruption scandal has been unearthed and a lot of prominent people are going to jail. I believe that the rules of the game for campaign finance as well as for bidding on government contracts has changed. But we need to allow the economy to recover. Is there such an equation where one decides to prosecute what we know, state that any future infractions will be dealt with the utmost severity, but let's move forward in order to allow the economy to recover?
I don't think the investigations have a bad impact in Brazil economy. I think the reasons were different. There are different reasons for the losses of the economy in the last years. And I think in medium and long term, these anti-corruption efforts, they only improve the efficiency of our economy. And it's no good to, you cannot solve this problem turning a blind eye. Maybe we could have an example here, a long example from the past. You have this great case called Watergate. And I heard that during the investigation and during the work of especially the Washington Post, some people complained that isn't it enough? Well, should we not forget Watergate and leave the politics free to do their work? But it gone to the end, and I think it make a better country, a better environment for the rule of law here in the United States. And as a judge, I don't have this discretionary power to, wow, let's take this, let's put this in the under the hug, and let's move on. I think that in time, this is bad, a very bad idea. If you have to deal with these problems in the past, so you could go on.
No, it's true that it's not necessarily the role of the judicial sector to worry about these questions. But you've also spoken about the role of public opinion and how important the support of Brazilians has been to the work that you've done, because it is essentially, it's kept the political world from interfering as much as it otherwise might have. But here we are, 4 years into the probe, and there are some signs of trouble on the front of political opinion. Democracy in Brazil is less popular, if you ask people in polls, than it has been in a generation. Only 25% of Brazilians told this Latino Barometro poll that they were satisfied with the state of their democracy. That's the lowest in all of Latin America. And I'm in Brazil a lot, and you sense that it's because people have grown frustrated with corruption. Certainly the economy plays a role, but they don't see any progress. They don't, after 4 years of these changes, and they were glad to see certain people go to jail, but they don't see yet that change. Does that worry you at all? And if so, if that isn't the role of the judicial sector to advance things, whose job is it?
I think it's a job for everyone, not only from judges, prosecutors, or regular citizens of this organized civil society, but of our, especially from our government or our leadership in government. And I understand people sometimes are frustrated, but these changes, there's no magic condoms to resolve the problems of democracy. People, in truth, I think they are not unsatisfied with democracy. They are unsatisfied with the problems of democracy. And it's work of everyone to fix these problems. And one of these major problems is widespread corruption and impunity. So people start to lose confidence in the rule of law. In time, they start to lose confidence in all the politicians and the judges, the prosecutors, and they start to lose confidence in democracy itself. So what is the answer for this insatisfaction is to make democracy stronger. And this demands that we need to break this rule of impunity and keep going with our work, and demand that our leadership, our government, act with integrity.
One issue that you hear a lot in Brazil, especially lately, is this notion of selective justice, is this notion that the car wash probe has targeted some people and not others. And I know that's the perception of the people outside today who were, exercising their democratic right to protest and make their voices heard. What's your response to that? I mean, why, again, it's not as if only people from the Workers' Party have gone to jail because of car wash. I mean, it's been multiple parties, but this perception is still there that one ideological group has been more punished than the others. How do you respond to that?
Well, returning to Manipulite, they used the word at that time against the prosecutors and the judges, toga rosa, red judges, because they work in several cases, and the most heavy cases were against politicians from the center right or the right, but that was because they were in the government at that time. And they also had cases against the Communist Party then, but less cases. And in my opinion, it occurs in Brazil the same thing. The most part of, for example, in Petrobras cases, the investigation revealed that part of the money went to the Petrobras executives and part of the money to the ruling parties who were responsible to sustain that executives in their positions. So it's a kind of natural consequence that the most part of the case are against politicians from the ruling parties at that time. But if you see the records, the judicial records, you will find politicians from the left and politicians from the right. For example, one famous politician who some people consider an enemy of the Workers' Party is in jail, is serving prison time.
Who are we talking about?
The former Speaker of the House. I don't like to say names here, but it's a case that are already tried. And about the protesters, sometimes people have some illusions. Sorry, sometimes there are party affiliates. Sometimes people have some illusions about some idols. And sometimes it gets time to people realize the truth. But if you go to the judicial records, you will see that nobody is being prosecuted or tried because of his political opinion, but because of bribes, because of money laundering, because of specific criminal conduct.
It's also true, perhaps, that some of the politicians in the center and center-right who have at least been mentioned in testimony have that protection because of this foro privilegiado, and they may face justice soon. They just haven't faced it with the same speed as people who no longer have that protection.
Some people say in Brazil about criminalization of politics, but well, really? Who is doing this is the part, or you cannot make a general statement, but who is doing this is some politicians. They are committing crimes, so they are doing this criminalization of politics, and the courts only react. There is no problem in general between judges and politicians. The problem is that some politicians committed crimes and they have to suffer the consequence because it's the rule of law. I agree with you. I think this is stand privilege, and that's not only me saying. Some of the justice of the Supreme Court, Brazilian Supreme Court, also say that this stand privilege works against works against accountability. So I think we should change this. Maybe we should.
You would like to see the end of foro privilegiado?
I think it would be a wise idea. Maybe, if necessary, keeping it for the president, but I'm not really sure about this. I think in the extension that we have this stand privilege today, it works against...
It's like hundreds of people.
Yes, hundreds of people, all congressmen and all secretaries of the government.
Just one comment on the ideological aspect of this. I was interested in the comment that Dr. Ugas made when we spoke in the days leading up to the conference. I'd forgotten this, that the anti-corruption movement is seen in Peru as the language of the left, right? Because so many of the people who have been prosecuted there are either center or center right or right. So it's, to your point, maybe it's not ideological, it's just the people who are in power.
I think that's very... It's necessary to say that corruption is not a politician from the left or from the right. Corruption is the opposite of politics, I think. It's just criminal behavior.
So we have time for two questions, and I'd like to ask, we'll just ask them back to back, and then we'll give Judge Morrow an opportunity to respond. So if you'd like to ask Judge Sergio Moro a question, please, please raise your hand.
Well, I thank you for coming and thank you for being here.
Would you identify yourself, please?
I'm Dan Newcomb. I'm a lawyer at Sherman & Sterling.
Thank you.
And one of the things that your prosecution has done is coordinate with the United States, coordinate with other countries, but at the same time, the prosecutions across Latin America have spread well beyond the countries you coordinated with. What is the role of the judiciary in coordinating the unintended consequences of the prosecution?
Is there a second question? There is not. Wow, shy group. We'll have to fix that. Yeah, Michelle.
Sorry.
It's okay. Can we have a microphone? We'll just wait for the microphone, please. Sorry. Thank you.
Michelle Caruso Cabrera from CNBC here in the United States. Attorneys that we've spoken from in Brazil who represent some of the people that you've prosecuted have complained that some of your methodologies may not be legal. And one of the big complaints was, for example, promising that the statements that they made would be kept silent and then, or secret, and then suddenly the deposition and the verbatim of the deposition is leaked within hours to the press. Does your office do that? And is that by design?
Do you want to start with the first one?
About the first one. During the investigation, it was discovered that some of the Brazilian companies who paid bribes in Petrobras contract, also paid bribes abroad. Okay. And the Brazilian policy on this, I think, is to share the evidence to those who request the evidence. Maybe in some case we have to establish a condition because a big part of this evidence we get from plea agreements. And so there are some conditions to protect the people who gave the evidence. But as far as these conditions are accepted, we are ready to share the evidence with the other countries in their region. And that's all that we can do, because we could not do anymore. It will be necessary in each country to do its own efforts against corruption. I am very impressed, for example, by the work that is being made in Peru. I think they already have a lot of important cases in Peru against politicians who take bribes. But it's important to say also that it's necessary to have a large picture, because Brazilian companies probably are not the only villains in this story. Probably these people who took bribes from them probably took bribes from other foreign companies, and maybe from companies of their own country, because of environment favorable for bribery. So it's important not to vilify too much the Brazilian companies. They're not the only ones who paid bribes in the world.
And then the question about your methods and the leaks.
Well, let me explain something. Sometimes there is some confusion between leaks and public trials. Okay, it's in Brazil, our constitution demands that we cannot have secret procedures or secret trials. So in this case, this is Lava Jato operation. We understand that once a criminal charge is presented, everything should go public. Okay. During the investigation, sometimes it's necessary to have secret to be efficient investigation. But after the investigation gets to an end, again, it's necessary to make all available to the public. There could be during the investigation, maybe some one or two, or maybe some leaks, but I can assure you that I'm not responsible for anyone. And it's very difficult to do an investigation about leaks. Returning to the Watergate case here, wow, how long does it take to discover who was the one responsible?
Deep throat.
Yes. And well, if you look to the whole case, the widespread corruption, all the problems with impunity, I think it's wrong to have this attention on the leaks. Wow. The problems were the leaks on this case, or the criminal behavior of all these people. But again, I'm against leaks. As a judge, I could not. I have to obey strictly the law, but I don't see the leaks on this case as a major problem.
You will be around for our second panel this morning, but this is the conclusion of this interview, and thank you so much for being here. A round of applause for Judge Moore. Thank you. As we prepare for our next panel and get everybody on the stage, I'd like to show you a video about a remarkable initiative being put together by the Brazilian organizations Vortex and Humanitas 360 that's basically using visual data mapping to show the extent of the case. And while we show this, I'd invite the next panel to come on up.
The former president of Brazil, the former president of Panama, the former president of Peru, the vice president of Ecuador. What do they all have in common? All of those politicians are connected in a network of corruption unveiled by the Operation Car Wash, conducted by the Brazilian Federal Police and the Federal Justice Courts. The operation has revealed the payment of billions of dollars in bribes by Brazilian companies in many countries, making it the biggest corruption scandal in history. The Vortex Foundation has partnered with Humanitas 360 to compile and analyze thousands of documents of all the legal processes originated from the investigation. With sophisticated methods of analysis and modern data visualization tools, the digital platform reveals a complex transnational criminal structure connecting more than 906 public and private agents in thousands of interactions throughout the world. As the world gets more connected and corruption becomes more transnational and complex, Vortex and Humanitas 360 are offering this platform to public prosecutors and journalists across the continent to generate new connections and lines of investigation, which can strengthen criminal processes as well as news coverage about Latin America's battle against corruption.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to be here to moderate this next session. I just want to echo a few things that Brian said. As I look at the region, corruption really is the seminal issue today. This is an issue that affects security, as we all know. It affects economic growth. It affects the development of human capital of the people in the region and the money that is or is not spent on education, on healthcare. It affects the functioning democracy, and it really affects Latin America's faith in their government. So this is the seminal issue, I would argue, in these countries and many around the world. And as I've watched Latin America for the last few decades now, what is surprising to me, but surprising in a good way, is that when I first started going there and living in the region, when we talked about corruption, it was sort of whispers in the hallways, or it was raised eyebrows at various people meeting and doing things. While today it has become daily front page news, it has filled the dockets of many courts, and it is one of the big issues in all of the presidential campaigns today. And that is a transformation that I think is incredibly important to recognize. The other important thing to recognize is that all of the gentlemen up here on the panel have been integral in that shift, in making that shift happen over the last several years. And so we are very lucky to have them all here. You all have their fuller bios, so I won't go into that more generally. But just to point out as we go down, we have Eduardo Engel, who comes to us from Chile. He has, when these corruption scandals emerged in Chile under the Bachelet government, he was brought in to help design reforms that became laws. We have Jose Ugacier, who has chaired Transparency International, so leading this charge from the outside of governments rather than from the inside. We have the Attorney General Nestor Martinez from Colombia, who is leading the charge today there in a country that some studies say 10% of the federal budget every year goes to corruption. That's the amount, the extent of corruption. We have Dr. Iván Velásquez, who comes to us from Guatemala, not originally from Guatemala, but in Guatemala today, who leads the UN effort, CICIG, in investigating corruption there. And with one of our other panelists on the next panel, Thelma Aldana, has taken down the former government for their bad behavior and continues to investigate anyone, including those in the current government, that deserve investigation. And then finally, we have here Rodrigo Janot, who is the recently former, just stepped down as Attorney General in Brazil and has been bold enough to take on private sector and public sector officials alike up to the top echelons of many areas, but the elite there with no fear, like our previous panelist. So with all this wealth of information and not a whole lot of time, I'm going to ask all of them to be very brief in what they could expand on for hours. But I would like to do a few rounds of the same question of everyone, so we can get an idea from each country or from a regional perspective how they see things developing. So my first question that I would like to start off with is really just taking a glimpse at the track record. And here, what have we, in these last few years, what have we accomplished in Latin America? What have we accomplished on the anti-corruption issue? Where are we? What are the successes? We can talk a bit about what hasn't happened, but really let's talk about the positive here, because there has been this big change. So let me ask you each to talk a bit about, in your country, what have been the accomplishments? And actually, let me turn first to Jose, because you'll provide a bit of a regional perspective, as well as, I hope, the Peruvian one. But what have we accomplished and something that you've been fighting for so long?
First of all, I think we need to hear that corruption in the region is historical, structural, and systemic. And for decades, it's not always, impunity has been a rule, and we have had a lot of corruption in most of our countries. So what is starting to change is what Judge Moro just mentioned. Now there are several movements around our countries breaking or starting to break impunity. Where is this going to end? We don't know. But for the first time, we are having a trend in the region with very, very high-level officials, former presidents, current presidents, vice presidents, ministers, high-level officials from the executive, parliamentarians, judges from the Supreme Court going to prison or being tried. And at the same time, emblematic CEOs of huge companies from the private sector. We haven't seen that before, except some specific cases when some guy got in political trouble. So I think this is totally new. The other thing I believe is quite new is people engagement with the anti-corruption movement. We've seen millions of people going to the streets in Brazil for months, thousands of people in Guatemala and Honduras putting pressure on their governments in order to deal with corruption. We've seen more than 100,000 people in Dominican Republic in the Green March demanding the government taking action against corruption. And this is quite new. In Peru, there has also have been some movements. So I think people reacting in a region where corruption has been seen and lived as normal is something different. So I think this gives some hope for what we should expect in the near future.
Rodrigo, let me turn to you to talk specifically about Brazil. And as you look at the work that you've been doing, that Judge Moro and many other judges have been doing, what are the accomplishments you see in your country?
Bom dia a todos. Vou falar em português para não cometer erros. O Brasil, como os outros países da reunião, começou a reagir contra uma corrupção mais do que centenária em toda essa região. Os motivos foram vários. Sempre me perguntam se houve mudanças no Brasil. Eu gosto de responder, o Brasil não é o mesmo de 4 anos atrás. O Brasil vive uma realidade hoje em que todos os ex-presidentes, à exceção de um, respondem a processos criminais ou investigação criminal. O atual presidente da República, no exercício do seu mandato, responde por 2 processos criminais suspensos por um julgamento político da Câmara dos Deputados, mas os processos existem e aí continuarão. O ex-presidente, ou o então presidente da Câmara dos Deputados, foi afastado do seu mandato, foi afastado da presidência da Câmara e encontra-se hoje preso. Um senador da República, pela primeira vez, foi preso, e não era um senador qualquer, era o senador líder do governo no Senado. Em um determinado dia do mês de fevereiro, que eu não me recordo aqui o dia, saiu uma nota na imprensa dizendo: hoje, todos os ex-governadores do estado do Rio de Janeiro estão presos. Todos. Vários senadores e deputados respondem a processos penais. Vários ministros respondem a processos penais. Isso aconteceu no Brasil. O futuro, ninguém pode fazer uma prospecção. O que eu posso afirmar é que o Brasil não é o mesmo. Temos hoje um Brasil diferente.
Thank you. Nestor, let me ask you about Colombia, and especially since you are in that role today, that you were working to combat. What are the accomplishments that you or those around you have occurred?
Aló. Varios puntos. Primero, el mensaje de que la ley es para todos. Esa vieja idea de que la ley es solo para secretarias, oficiales mayores, ha muerto en Colombia. Segundo, no más impunidad frente a los casos de corrupción. En un poco más de un año que llevamos como fiscales generales en Colombia, hemos judicializado 1.645 personas por corrupción. De ellas, 500 funcionarios públicos, desde el más alto nivel, gobiernos, senadores, gobernadores de estados, alcaldes de municipios, contratistas del Estado, exservidores públicos, en causas que a la fecha comprometen casos de corrupción por más de $1 billón que hemos logrado identificar en este año de actividad investigativa. Tercero, a partir de la acción de la justicia, el ciudadano pierde su indiferencia, empieza a denunciar. Al punto que el año anterior, el delito después del hurto, del robo, que tuvo más alta tasa de crecimiento en Colombia, fue la denuncia por delitos contra la administración pública. La acción de la justicia lleva al ciudadano a denunciar, o sea, se empieza a recuperar la confianza institucional en el Poder Judicial. Eso es muy importante. Y por supuesto, y este es un tema que queda para discusión en el panel, en la medida en que la justicia descubre que la corrupción es sistémica, no solamente a nivel global, por supuesto, sino también en Colombia, le queda un papel al poder ciudadano para producir los cambios y las transformaciones en la institucionalidad que requiere ese estado de corrupción que se está advirtiendo global, regional y nacionalmente.
Iván, let me turn to you, because you too are day-to-day on the front lines, but you have a bit of a distinctive role. You are not part of the government of Guatemala. You're coming from the outside. What are the accomplishments that you see in Guatemala from your role coming from the UN side of things?
Creo que algo importante es mostrar a partir de la investigación criminal y no como un estudio simplemente teórico, lo que se ha planteado y que mencionaban tanto José Ugaz como Néstor Humberto Martínez, y es la corrupción sistémica estructural. Creo que las investigaciones que con el Ministerio Público hemos adelantado en Guatemala han permitido demostrar eso como una realidad. Y eso implica el poder identificar exactamente una situación de esta naturaleza, también implica que el Ministerio Público debe adoptar nuevas formas de enfrentar lo que significa una corrupción sistémica. Pero hemos demostrado además que la lucha contra la corrupción es posible. Ya no es un tema que se pudiera tener como aspiración, sino que en casos específicos, lo que se ha logrado desarrollar respecto de altos funcionarios de todas las esferas del Estado, presidentes del Congreso, magistrados de la Corte Suprema de Justicia, presidentes de la República, ministros, directores de entidades administrativas, es decir, algo que ha mostrado que en efecto nadie está por encima de la ley. Y creo que esto además ha logrado mover a la ciudadanía, y mover a la ciudadanía en un proceso también de construcción de nueva ciudadanía. Ha despertado la conciencia colectiva y en varios aspectos diferentes. De un lado, lo que significa la expresión de rechazo a la corrupción, lo que significan las manifestaciones rechazando la corrupción, pero también lo que implica respaldar la lucha contra la corrupción. Son dos manifestaciones diferentes. Y una tercera, el crecimiento de la auditoría social. En Guatemala, así como ocurrió también en Brasil recientemente, pretensiones del legislativo de adoptar leyes de impunidad fueron rechazadas por grandes manifestaciones ciudadanas. Y en Guatemala, por lo menos el 13 de septiembre del año pasado, la reacción social implicó que el Congreso, 2 días después, el 15 de septiembre, revocara esas propias leyes. Yo creo que esto significa que hay una ciudadanía activa y que está en dirección de fortalecimiento del Estado de Derecho, que es finalmente lo que mueve en esto del trabajo de la lucha contra la corrupción, lo que señalaba el juez Moro al inicio. La lucha contra la corrupción, podría afirmarse, es una forma de luchar por la realidad, por la vigencia real del Estado de Derecho.
Thank you. And then finally, Eduardo, let me ask you to reflect a bit on Chile. And this case seems to me somewhat different from the Guatemalan one we just heard about, in that when faced with a big corruption scandal, not just the courts, but the government and the legislature, the Congress, reacted a bit differently. So please talk about the accomplishments in the fight against corruption that you've been involved in Chile.
So when you have these major corruption scandals, there's a silver lining, and which is you have a window of opportunity where you can make major reforms which lead to more accountable societies, more accountable political systems, more transparency, overall have major state reforms. In normal times, these reforms are almost impossible to push through Congress because those who are supposed to approve them, which are members of Congress and the executive, lose power in the process and are not very enthusiastic about them. But when you have these corruption scandals, this implicit veto power is lost. And if you take the opportunity correctly, you can make major reforms. In the case of Chile, President Bachelet appointed a presidential commission, which in 45 days made a very ambitious set of proposals, which went all the way from very specific things about the legal system, about what to do with conflicts of interest and asset disclosure, to the deepest causes of corruption, like the regulation of the relation between money and politics, both campaign finance and political party finance. And this served as a basis for an ambitious agenda which has gone through Congress and which has approved more than 10 laws in the last 3 years, including a major reform of campaign finance law, political party regulations, making parties much more democratic and transparent, a major revamp of Chile's civil service and the like. So I think Chile in that sense has taken the opportunity to make it considerably less likely that these scandals happen again in the future. Essentially, there's two challenges when this happens. On the one hand, bringing those who were responsible for the scandals to justice. And in this panel, we have part of the success stories, and absent here, we have other countries where very little has happened in Latin America. So this is a very mixed bag if you look at the entire continent. In some countries, we know a lot about what happened, and very little has been done about it because you have judicial systems which are not that autonomous and independent. But the other challenge, which is the medium-long run challenge, I think is crucial, is taking the opportunity to make these major reforms which go to the symptoms of corruption, but also to the deeper causes of corruption, and change the rules of the game systemically in a way that make it less likely that this happens in the future, and that then when we look at this with the passage of time, tells us that this was really an improvement that stayed over time, that persisted over time.
Thank you. Now let me ask each of you to talk a bit about the actual functioning of corruption in your societies, in your countries. And in any unsavory deal, there are almost always two sides. And often within these deals, the private sector is on the other side or on one of these sides. So let's talk a little bit about the role of the private sector, both for bad, but also perhaps for good. Have you seen, as these trials have gone, as corruption has been uncovered, have you seen at all a change in the role of the private sector or even particular companies in the way they are addressing this issue? So let me start, actually, Iván, let me start with you in Guatemala. How do you see the private sector playing a role here? And have you seen any evolution or shifts during your time?
Yo creo que sí ha habido una evolución en el comportamiento del sector privado. Tal vez los empresarios, tanto como la sociedad en su conjunto, estaban como en un ambiente de así son las cosas, así es como se debe proceder. No hay alternativa, de manera que simplemente hacemos como se ha hecho. Pero a partir de las investigaciones y de el que se haya descubierto muchas de esas relaciones negativas de corrupción, han llevado a los empresarios a cuestionarse sobre lo que fue su actividad. Ya no tanto es la excusa que estamos sometidos a un chantaje porque es que si no procedíamos de determinada forma tampoco la administración iba a respondernos de esta otra forma. Es decir, si no pagábamos un soborno, entonces no se nos adjudicaba el contrato o no nos pagaban por el avance de la obra. Y que van comprendiendo, y es una afirmación explícita que me han hecho empresarios en Guatemala, ya sabemos que las cosas no se pueden seguir haciendo como las hacíamos. Ya sabemos que si lo repetimos acciones de estas, vamos a tener una consecuencia. Y esto yo creo que es de lo más importante que hay en estos movimientos contra la corrupción. Poder generar la cultura de la consecuencia. Que quien cometa un hecho tenga por lo menos el temor que efectivamente va a sufrir una consecuencia, y esa es la vía para la construcción de la cultura de legalidad.
Rodrigo, let me turn to you, because many Brazilian business leaders have faced consequences that we were just talking about. What do you see? Do you see a change in the way the private sector or parts of the private sector are doing business, particularly with the government, but more generally, what changes do you or do you not see?
Quando essa investigação começou, foi descoberto grupo de empreiteiras que tinham regulamento de atuação que imitava o regulamento de uma competição de futebol. Assim se comportavam essas empreiteiras. Diferentemente das mãos limpas, por questões jurídicas, então na Itália e agora no Brasil, essa investigação ela se direcionou contra o setor público e também o setor privado. Nós tivemos resultados de grandes empresários presos, de grandes empresários que jamais pensaram em passar uma hora sequer numa cadeia e passaram algum tempo mais do que uma hora. Nós conseguimos fazer algumas diferenças de comportamento empresarial. Eu vou dar um exemplo, não vou dizer o nome das empresas, mas nessa investigação, o Ministério Público Federal do Brasil desenvolveu um sistema que se chama SIMBA, que esse sistema trata de informações bancárias na quebra dos sigilos bancários. E esse sistema nós facultamos a quem quiser gratuitamente, né, foram usadas chaves públicas, e alguns bancos, nos seus países de origem, diziam que não era possível prestar a informação naquela forma que era necessária para fazer o sistema funcionar. E os procuradores gerais desses países de origem me perguntavam, como? Eu falei, como? Se esses bancos operam no Brasil e nos informam dessa maneira, como não podem informar nos seus países de origem? E isso só foi possível no Brasil porque nós fizemos um acordo com a Federação dos Bancos do Brasil. A FEBRABAN, que é a Federação dos Bancos do Brasil, conseguiu com que os bancos se alinhassem ao prestar essas informações. Hoje, a realidade é que essas empresas que jamais incluíram no cálculo dos seus custos os atos de corrupção, estão vendo agora que é muito caro você pagar suborno. São custos enormes para a empresa e custos enormes dentro e fora do Brasil. As multas, as ações coletivas, a restituição dos valores que foram usurpados. E o que se espera do futuro, e já terminando. Em todo esse processo, o que a gente constatou foi que os órgãos públicos de controle não tiveram a eficiência necessária para a prevenção desses atos de corrupção. Então, os órgãos públicos têm que entender que, no que se refere ao aspecto prevenção, houve, sim, um problema. De outro lado, o setor empresarial, com a tendência de autorregulação, também não funcionou, porque isso foi para um lado em que tanto não funcionou que os atos de corrupção aconteceram. O que eu vejo no futuro é que, de todo o resultado dessa investigação, os órgãos públicos, associados ao setor privado, através das suas políticas de prevenção internas efetivas, possam agora exercer com mais eficácia a prevenção. Então, o futuro que eu vejo é setor público de controle e setor privado trabalhando juntos na prevenção aos atos de corrupção.
Nestor, let me ask you about Colombia. And we've seen, an expansion in your activities and investigations, and as you said, this wave of citizen complaints. So how is the private sector reacting in the way they do things to this change, I would say, in the government role?
Por décadas, el sector privado señalaba la corrupción como una enfermedad solo de la política. El sector privado no ha querido reconocer genuinamente que la corrupción es una moneda que tiene dos caras, una en el sector público y otra necesariamente en el sector privado. Los contratistas del Estado han entendido en la política local colombiana, en la de las municipalidades, en la regional y en la nacional, que el tema de la financiación de las campañas políticas es una ventana de oportunidad para hacer grandes negocios y crecer. Financiar las campañas para obtener lealtades. Y ese tema de la financiación no se toca en las reformas electorales en este momento en mi país y no se toca en la mayor parte del continente. Luego, se trata de preservar el statu quo y allí hay que ser consciente, los empresarios tienen que entender cuál es la cuota de responsabilidad. Una anécdota que puede explicar un poco hasta qué punto el sector privado tiene que reflexionar mucho más sobre su papel en este proceso. El Attorney General de los Estados Unidos, el señor Sessions, estuvo en Cartagena, Colombia, invitado por el fiscal colombiano el pasado 8 de diciembre. Y no podíamos llegar rápidamente a la sede de las reuniones porque el empresariado en Cartagena estaba reunido en un club social, haciéndole un desagravio a la administración de Reficar. Reficar es el caso de corrupción más grande de Colombia, una planta de transformación para gasolina que estaba presupuestada en $3 billones, terminó costando $8 billones. Odebrecht es una cosa chiquitica frente a Reficar. Y el presidente de los industriales colombianos hacía el homenaje de desagravio a la administración de Reficar responsable de estos actos de corrupción. De cara a la sociedad, el Attorney General de los Estados Unidos me decía, no te lo puedo creer, General, esto es imposible. Entonces, ¿hasta qué punto estamos tomando conciencia de esta realidad? Y por último, no siempre la corrupción tiene en el otro lado de la moneda al sector público. El sector privado debería ser consciente que hay casos típicos de corrupción privada 100%. Panama Papers. Colombia es tal vez uno de los pocos países en donde Panama Papers ya tiene personas en la cárcel. Empresas de abogados, Mossack Fonseca, vendían en la región, incluida Colombia, facturas falsas para disminuir los impuestos en nuestros países y crear canales cambiarios para sacar dinero de nuestras naciones hacia paraísos fiscales. Corrupción 100% privada. El sector privado tiene que tomar conciencia de su cuota de responsabilidad.
Eduardo, let's talk about Chile, a country where often it's thought that the private sector is quite concentrated. Have they changed in the wake of the work you did and of the revelation of many of these scandals? What do you see?
Basically, the private sector in Chile has been more reactive than proactive when it comes to the anti-corruption agenda. This has been in the middle of, as Brian said, a fastly growing middle class and social media, which make their participation and they're much more educated in politics very easy. And they've not only complained about corruption, but also about a feeling of being abused by private companies. So antitrust and consumer protection are also high on the agenda. And also on that front, the private sector in Chile has been much more reactive than proactive in general. I think that not only in Chile, but in Latin America, what we're seeing offers a wonderful opportunity to the private sector, which is we now know much better than we ever knew all the details of how corruption takes place in the provision of infrastructure. The Odebrecht case and those involving other companies in Brazil and throughout Latin America allows us to go from anecdotes and conjectures to all the plea bargains, which many of the people here have been responsible for putting together, and all the information how actually corruption took place, not just a couple of anecdotes. And that should lead, I think, to new rules of the game in how we provide infrastructure, not only to have corruption out of the game, but also, as part of this, there's a huge cost of corruption infrastructure, which is that we end up paying much, much more than we should for infrastructure which is badly needed in our countries. And I invite and I believe that the private sector can play there a role which is as important as the public sector in fostering new rules of the game which actually make it much easier for the more efficient firms to win these contracts and not for those firms who are better connected politically. I think that's the major challenge about which we could talk a lot. And I think the opportunity is here because we can now make these proposals based on actual data. There's hundreds and hundreds of plea bargains with the details of how corruption took place, which then itself can lead to how you should strengthen institutions that provide infrastructure, both through public provision and through public-private partnerships. It's not surprising that in most countries in Latin America, for example, in the concession business, in the public-private partnership business, there's very few United States firms there. It's not that they're not good at building roads or other type of infrastructure. It's that they're not good or have a legal system which includes the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes it very costly to pay bribes, and therefore they cannot compete on equal terms. So if you had rules of the game which made it attractive for foreign firms from the countries which have the most efficient firms to participate, you could get infrastructure in Latin America at a much lower price and without the corruption we have seen taking place in most of our countries.
Great, and then finally, Jose, could you talk a bit, last night we were discussing and several people said that actually Transparency International has become a reference for the private sector, particularly for multinational companies, as they look at Latin America or more broadly. How do you see perhaps the role, how do you see the evolution of the private sector response, and maybe perhaps even talk a bit about Transparency International and in your engagement with these companies on these issues?
Okay, there's so much to say on this topic that I will try to be telegraphic. First, the role of the private sector, despite some exceptions in Latin America, has been very pernicious. If we see what had happened with extractive industries, oil, gas, fisheries, mining, timber, all of them have been involved in huge schemes of corruption. And a specific mention here to the financial sector, the role of the banks. If we see what the financial sector has been playing regarding corruption, it's just astonishing. If we see the list of the banks that have been sanctioned because of laundering money for corrupt purposes, we are not talking about little banks on islands or the little bank that was bought, the branch that was bought by Odebrecht in Antigua. We are talking about the top banks of the world, billions of dollars of fines against these banks because they were caught laundering money. So the role has been very negative. Why? They basically allege two reasons. One is fear. We are victims of extortion. A corrupt state is putting pressure on us. If we don't get into a corrupt deal, then we are out of the business. The other real argument is that most of them decided to go through the easy path. When I saw Dionisio Romero, the most powerful man, owner of the largest bank in Peru, in a video arriving to an agreement with Vladimiro Montesinos, the mastermind of corruption in Peru, and saying he was going to provide political support in exchange of commercial favors from the government, commercial benefits for him, then I understood that basically entrepreneurs have not been victims. They have been complicit with corruption for decades in our region. And here also we need to mention the role that has been played by the business associations. CACIF in Guatemala, CONFIEP in Peru. Yesterday, CONFIEP had to recognize that they received $300,000 from Odebrecht in order to pay the campaign of one candidate. What has an association of business to do promoting one candidate against the other, if not obtain favors once the result is produced? So this has generated this huge crisis for the private sector. Companies that have taken efforts of decades to arrive to their position are losing their companies, their CEOs are in prison, they are broken, reputational impact seriously. So I think this is a moment, and I believe that some people in the private sector, some entrepreneurial leaders are thinking of the need of change. And in that sense, Transparency International, particularly the chapters of the region, we are working on a project in order to propose the new leaders of the business sector. Because if you go and look at the business sector in our countries, you will see basically two groups. The traditional big companies still denying the situation, saying that they are victims, that it is not their problem, and a new generation of entrepreneurs that are really willing to change and are understanding that if there is no change in the region, there will be no future. So we are working in a project to try to create a new model of doing business in Latin America with integrity. And of course, this starts from building trust, because there is very little trust between private sector and NGOs, and that is something that is also a consequence of corruption.
I'm going to ask one more question and do a round, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So please think a bit about what you might want to ask our panelists. And this question is the question of lessons learned. So we now have a few years, if not several years, fighting corruption. What have been the mistakes, or if not the mistakes, what might you have done differently in hindsight in taking on some of these big cases or this overall issue of corruption in your country? And Rodrigo, let me start with you. What would you have done differently, perhaps, in hindsight?
Eu acho que cometemos erros e acertos, muito mais acertos do que erros. Dos erros da minha equipe de investigação foi não termos sabido tratar dos assuntos, veicular esses assuntos através da imprensa. Muitos dos atos em que praticávamos eram atos novos e com base em instrumentos de investigação novos. E para as pessoas era difícil entender essas decisões. Eu dou um exemplo. Nós fizemos um acordo com um grande frigorífico brasileiro, que tem empresas aqui também nos Estados Unidos, e esses executivos, fizemos um acordo penal, esses executivos, 4 deles, receberam, em troca do que nos entregavam na investigação, como premiação, a imunidade. Esse fato nos gerou muito problema e nós não soubemos esclarecer devidamente à imprensa e à opinião pública porque chegamos a conceder a imunidade. Esses cidadãos, eles nos entregaram crimes em curso praticados pelo presidente da República no exercício do cargo. Esses cidadãos nos entregaram a prática de crimes em curso de um senador da República importante, que na última eleição teve nada mais, nada menos do que 52 milhões de votos no Brasil e seria virtualmente o novo presidente da República. Esses cidadãos nos entregaram um colega que cometia um crime de vender a sua própria instituição indicando o planejamento das investigações para esses empresários. Essas pessoas se comprometeram, antes de homologado o acordo, de realizarem ações controladas, autorizadas pela Justiça, e com essas ações controladas foi possível que obtivéssemos prova do cometimento de crime pelo presidente da República, pelo deputado que a ele representava, pelo senador da República. Esses crimes foram comprovados, a sua materialidade, com o dinheiro apreendido, eles foram filmados, eles foram gravados. E, pela primeira vez, em 120 colaborações premiadas, nós tínhamos uma colaboração que nos entregava crimes em curso, e crimes praticados por essas mais altas autoridades da República. E nós não soubemos explicar com objetividade para a imprensa e para a opinião pública por que chegamos a tomar aquela decisão. Então, para ficar em um só, eu apontaria como uma modificação, se eu tivesse que fazer tudo de novo, seria tratar de maneira mais profissional a divulgação dos dados e a divulgação dos fatos com a imprensa e com a opinião pública.
Iván, in retrospect, is there anything you would have done differently?
Bueno, desde el punto de vista de la investigación criminal, que es en lo que estamos realmente, yo creo que vamos formándonos adecuadamente y en la cooperación con el Ministerio Público, la capacidad de transferencias técnicas y de investigación criminal. Más que, por lo tanto, no podría hablar de errores en cuanto a administración de justicia, pero sí podría señalar deficiencias en Guatemala en la administración de justicia. De un lado, y creo que para poder luchar con éxito contra la corrupción es indispensable el tema de la independencia judicial. Me parece que sin independencia judicial, sin jueces independientes, la lucha contra la corrupción es realmente difícil, porque es luchar no solo contra ese monstruo, sino también contra la traba que dentro del propio sistema de justicia se puede generar en virtud de las indebidas injerencias que hay en la administración de justicia. Me parece adicionalmente que en Guatemala el organismo judicial tal vez no estaba preparado para una tan grande demanda de justicia como se ha venido produciendo ahora con estos grandes casos. Y eso ha generado un retraso, una acumulación que en su manifestación más preocupante es la falta de sentencias. Y la falta de sentencias, como se mencionaba acá ahora, esta mañana, la falta de sentencias produce también una desconfianza ciudadana, inclusive hasta para llegar a la crítica del propio organismo instructor. Si no hay sentencias es porque el Ministerio Público no tiene seguridad, certeza respecto de la contundencia probatoria de sus acusaciones, pero en realidad no es el Ministerio Público el que tiene la capacidad de dictar sentencias. Este es un tema exclusivo del organismo judicial. Sin embargo, esa deficiencia creo que ha afectado particularmente en Guatemala, ha afectado la lucha contra la corrupción por una circunstancia. Es que si no hay efectivamente una respuesta, y la respuesta se da es en términos de sentencia, se va perdiendo la confianza, la esperanza, inclusive el entusiasmo. Si a partir de lo que logramos hacer en el 2015, para el 2016, 2017 hubiera habido sentencias de casos como el de la línea, para señalar este que se ha mencionado acá, que empezó en el mes de abril del 2015, la ciudadanía hubiera entendido, esto sí tiene un sentido, esto sí tiene una consecuencia real en términos de sentencia. No es que no haya existido fallos condenatorios, pero no de la cantidad y de la naturaleza que nosotros aspiráramos.
Estos casos de corrupción global, de corrupción transnacional, nos invitan a reflexionar si la sociedad global, la sociedad de naciones, lo está haciendo bien en su conjunto. Es claro que las sociedades nacionales, los ministerios públicos de Panamá, de Perú, de Brasil, de Colombia, etcétera, de Guatemala, en la lucha contra la corrupción, lo están haciendo bien, pero la humanidad en su conjunto lo está haciendo bien. Esa es una gran pregunta. ¿Por qué? hemos tenido casos de corrupción internacional que se gesta en unos países, digámoslo con claridad, siempre en países industrializados, que llegan a ofender los valores de la administración pública de terceros países. ¿Y cómo hemos abordado el tema como comunidad de naciones? A través de unas convenciones internacionales. El derecho de las convenciones de Naciones Unidas, la Convención de Mérida, la Convención de la OCDE, tipificaron un nuevo delito que se llama el soborno internacional. Pero el soborno internacional se produce en nuestros países, es como un cohecho. El cohecho siempre ha existido. En consecuencia, si se tipifica otra forma de lesión de los valores de una sociedad como soborno transnacional, vamos a investigar de dos maneras distintas y desde distintas jurisdicciones los mismos hechos, y eso plantea unos problemas enormes en la comunidad internacional. Por ejemplo, el non bis in idem. Ecuador decidió no firmar las condicionalidades del Ministerio Público de Brasil para investigar los casos de corrupción. Pero cuando avanzó frente a los oficiales de Odebrecht, le tocó decretar la preclusión porque ya habían sido condenados en su país de origen. Las convenciones internacionales le dan una preferencia en la investigación a la jurisdicción de los países corruptores, no de los países ofendidos, de tal manera que mantienen la competencia sobre sus empresas, sobre sus funcionarios, y eso genera un conflicto de interés, porque a esos estados lo que más les importa es preservar a sus empresas, a sus fuentes de trabajo, y el valor de la justicia global queda muy disminuido. Es legítimo que nosotros, los fiscales de los distintos países, hayamos apelado a las delaciones para obtener la verdad. Pero la comunidad global, el universo, no entiende el modelo de delaciones. El caso de Lavallato se desarrolla a partir de delaciones de los oficiales de Odebrecht en Brasil, pero los ciudadanos de Panamá, de Ecuador, de Colombia, de México, no entienden por qué no se puede actuar frente a ellos a partir de la delación, porque no se podría utilizar la autoincriminación como una forma de iniciar acciones penales contra esas personas. Entonces, en estos casos globales, no deberíamos buscar formas de delaciones globales, porque de lo contrario podemos caer en una dificultad enorme. Brasil no ofrece cooperación judicial sino a aquellos países que acepten la condición de no juzgar a los delatores del caso de Odebrecht en Brasil. Y en los países donde hubo la corrupción, entonces no queda sino una sola fuente de información, la de los cohechados, la de los funcionarios públicos. Y la sociedad global podría incurrir en una trampa inaceptable, que los que dieron las coimas delaten en sus países de origen y quedan en un régimen de inmunidad frente a la sociedad global. Y los que recibieron las coimas delaten a su turno a los que les ofrecieron los sobornos, con lo cual ninguna de las dos partes terminaría enfrentando la acción de la justicia. La comunidad internacional va a tener que tomarse en serio cómo vamos a enfrentar la corrupción global. Concluyo, el tema de las indemnidades. El caso de Odebrecht es muy interesante, porque Estados Unidos, Brasil y Suiza convinieron una pena de 1.8 billones de dólares a cargo de la empresa para que la empresa continúe. Hay una discusión global, no para los países donde tienen origen estas empresas, si esas empresas deben continuar, y si deben continuar en cabeza de sus propietarios sin ninguna sanción global. Esa es una gran pregunta que tiene que hacerse la sociedad de hoy. Pero adicionalmente, en estos casos es muy importante saber, ¿y esas indemnidades son para quiénes? ¿Solo para los países donde se gestó la corrupción? Y los países ofendidos, México, Panamá, Colombia, Ecuador, Perú, Chile, no tienen derecho a ninguna participación sobre esa multa para resarcirse el daño. Lo lógico no es que la comunidad global empiece a globalizar las soluciones judiciales para que también haya indemnidades a los países en donde se generó esa corrupción. Cuestionamientos que no hemos resuelto todavía.
It's closely related. So let me talk about issues pending, which is quite similar. In the case of Chile, the control of corruption indices are among the best in Latin America, together with Uruguay, Chile, and Uruguay stand out as having relatively little corruption, much closer to developed country levels than the rest of the region. In the case of Chile, in a sort of nutshell and with a bit of a caricature, this is mainly due because central government has very little corruption, and at the level of local government, we have little money. Chile is a very centralized country, and the amount of monies in subnational governments is relatively little. In most countries, Chile included, there's much more corruption at the local level in municipalities and provinces or regions than there is in central government. Now, why do I say all of this? Because in the case of Chile, there's a major change coming up in a couple of years. There's going to be a major process of decentralization, of giving much more powers to the regions in Chile. Governors will be elected for the first time in a couple of years. The commission I presided made major proposals, which, like most of our proposals, were unanimous in this commission, which was very broad in the political views of its members. We made major proposals in terms of how to strengthen municipalities so that you reduce levels of corruption, and also include much more competent professionals so that you have strength on the professional side as well. If Chile does not tackle those reforms within the next couple of years, making sure that we reduce the space for corruption at the subnational level, this process of decentralization, which is part of a process of becoming a developed country, I'm not against it at all, but this process of decentralization can have a side cost which can be enormous in terms of increasing corruption if this is not tackled correctly. We still have time, but time is running out to do that.
From the Fujimori and Montesinos case, I think we achieved several lessons. On the positive side, we learned that having public opinion on your side is very relevant. So being transparent in the achievements, of course, putting out there the information you can put without putting in risk the investigation is key, and I think that really was a very positive achievement in the Peruvian case. Secondly, identify your allies, internally and from outside. Investigative journalism became one of the most relevant support we receive from the internal side of the country, but also we made very good agreements with international agencies, FBI from the United States, the FinCEN here also in the Financial Intelligence Unit, the prosecutors of Switzerland. All of these people really gave us international support in order to recover money in a very fast track. And the lesson there is that you need to go and have personal contact. It is not about sending papers and requests, because that really doesn't work. The third lesson is that we need to follow the money. This is an old rule, but it works. And if we follow the money, we can trace and find who is behind these movements. Finally, I think one of the major achievements, and it is also happening now in Brazil, was putting in place the plea bargaining law, having the possibility of receiving information and give some flexibility or leniency in exchange. On the negative side, I would say that the lesson we learned is that we were naive as investigators, thinking that we were going to change the corrupt environment, producing convictions and putting people in prison. Our prisons are full of detainees. In Guatemala, they have had to create camps to put all the corrupt people that Thelma and Iván are taking to justice. And in Peru, we did the same. We have had recently 2 presidents in prison, and then Toledo, who is hidden here in the States, Garcia, Fujimori's daughter, and the current president, Kuczynski, all of them under investigation of corruption. So what has changed after such a vigorous anti-corruption process conducted against Fujimori? Very little, because we didn't provide the lessons we received from the criminal proceedings to those who had the decision-making possibilities in order to change the structures. I started saying that corruption in our countries is structural and is systemic. And we are not going to change that reality from the judicial side. We need to provide that information and put pressure to those who can make the real change.
We have a few minutes left, so I am going to open it up to 2 questions, please. So anyone has a question, please make them brief. Go ahead, right here.
Yes, I'm Carlos Guimarães from LAG Investments and also a member of the board of this institution. And I have a question for Dr. Janot. Dr. Janot, vou fazer a pergunta em português ao senhor. E, primeiro, como brasileiro, eu quero parabenizar o que o senhor, doutor Sérgio Moro, tem feito e pela coragem de vocês. Acho que o Brasil tem uma dívida de gratidão em relação a vocês. A minha pergunta é em relação ao foro privilegiado e ao Supremo Tribunal. Olhando pela atuação recente do Supremo, a impressão que se tem é que não está em linha com os esforços que têm sido feitos pelo resto do Brasil. Políticos, hoje em dia, em posição de governo, lutam desesperadamente para ter acesso ao foro privilegiado, porque criou-se uma percepção que ter acesso a esse foro é muito próximo de imunidade, o que gera uma percepção muito negativa vindo da corte mais importante do país. Minha pergunta ao senhor é como é que o senhor está vendo a evolução disso?
And then I'm going to take one more question from right here.
Hi, I'm Pedro Abramovay. I'm the Latin American Director for the Open Society Foundations. Creo que voy a hacer también mi pregunta en español para... entonces, en primer lugar, es un placer ver muchos amigos ahí en la mesa. Doctor Ugaz, trabajamos mucho juntos en la Open Society, doctor Iván Velásquez, también con doctor Janot, a partir de la Transparencia Internacional, mucho trabajo juntos, y también con la Fiscalía de Colombia, sobre todo en temas de homicidios. Pero yo voy a hacer mi pregunta sobre todo a partir de mi trabajo hecho en el gobierno cuando era secretario nacional de Justicia, donde en el periodo de gobierno Lula, donde creamos prácticamente una parte importante de la legislación utilizada por Lavallato y por otros, ¿no? Y reconocida incluso fue en el periodo donde conocí al juez Moro en la Estrategia Nacional de Combate al Lavado de Dinero. Y nuestra apuesta en aquel momento era que si creáramos instituciones anticorrupción con dientes, de antilavado de dinero y todo, eso sería necesario para enfrentar la cultura patrimonialista, la cultura de corrupción existente en el Estado brasileño. Y un poco la visión de hoy, después de algunos años de un éxito profundo de esas medidas implementadas, sobre todo, claro, a partir de jueces y fiscales como los que están acá, hay una impresión que tal vez esa fuera una apuesta equivocada, ¿no? Y cuando uno mira a los resultados políticos de todo el esfuerzo anticorrupción, la gente que fue a la calle en Guatemala y el presidente que hoy ahí está, lo que pasó en Brasil y el presidente que ahí tenemos. En Perú, el Tribunal Electoral saca a 2 candidatos con problemas, se elige un candidato que, sobre todo porque estaba en contra de Fujimori, y hace un indulto y se mantiene. Entonces, la cuestión acá es si eso no es suficiente, ¿no? Si los cambios son profundos del punto de vista de anticorrupción, pero se está hoy en un momento de paralisía, ¿no? Y de intentos de parar eso, pero a partir de la sociedad civil, ¿no? en el espacio que estamos hoy, ¿cuáles serían las sugerencias para un cambio que va más allá del cambio de la solución de corrupción para llegar hacia la política?
Rodrigo, I'll start with you and I'll ask for brief answers.
Questão do foro privilegiado. Essa regra, nos diversos tribunais, leva a em torno de 28 mil autoridades a serem julgadas em tribunais e não a serem julgadas pelos juízes de primeiro grau. O problema, eu sou contra o Instituto do Foro Privilegiado, a não ser que seja restritíssimo. Acredito que o presidente da República, o presidente do Congresso, o presidente Supremo, estamos bem. Qual é o problema do foro privilegiado? No sistema de justiça do Brasil, a estrutura dele é um juiz de primeiro grau, ele forma o processo e o tribunal julga um recurso de um processo já formado. Com o foro privilegiado, essa lógica é invertida. O tribunal que tem estrutura para julgar recursos, ele deve formar um processo. E isso leva a uma lentidão na tramitação dos processos. Eu vou dar um exemplo. Se eu ofereço uma denúncia perante um juiz de primeiro grau, doutor Moro, ele recebe ou não essa denúncia com a caneta na mão. Com um parágrafo ele recebe essa denúncia. Se eu ofereço uma denúncia perante um tribunal, ao Supremo Tribunal Federal, onde eu ofereci as denúncias, tem que haver uma sessão plenária, hoje já mudou a regra, pode ser de turma também, mas então tinha que haver uma sessão plenária com 11 ministros que levam votos escritos e leem esses votos. Não funciona, o sistema assim não funciona. E eu acredito que foi idealizado com essa quantidade de pessoas com a prerrogativa de foro para não funcionar mesmo. Então, temos que falar a verdade, falar abertamente, né? Então, eu acho que tem que ser revisto isso, porque hoje a prerrogativa de foro leva à impunidade mesmo. Isso aí nós estamos vendo os resultados disso. Quanto à segunda, durante toda essa investigação, a gente ouviu muito que nós estávamos quebrando o sistema político e quebrando a economia e o sistema econômico. E a contra-resposta, né, a resposta que dávamos era: mas é esse sistema político que queremos? É essa economia cartelizada, oligopolizada que queremos? É essa economia que funciona à base de corrupção, que funciona à base de suborno? É essa a economia que queremos? Eu acho que não podemos proteger um sistema político ruim e nem uma economia que não se baseia na competição. Os melhores têm que desenvolver, têm que investir no seu processo produtivo, têm que investir no seu desenvolvimento tecnológico, têm que investir na garantia de seus produtos e serviços. É isso. Nós temos que lembrar que nós estamos num processo de quebra de paradigma. Nós estamos num processo de ruptura, uma ruptura pacífica. E toda ruptura leva a desgastes mesmo. A ruptura ela é dolorosa em si. E, depois de realizar essa ruptura, seja no sistema político, seja no sistema econômico, nós temos que trabalhar agora para reconstruir um sistema político sadio e um sistema econômico sadio. Eu acredito que a iniciativa privada ela tem mais rapidez de se adaptar a isso e de criar um sistema econômico sadio com muito maior velocidade que um sistema político. Portanto, não adianta investirmos em uma solução judicial para o problema do sistema político que o Brasil atravessa hoje. A solução está em alterar-se o sistema político. O sistema político ele gera todo esse caldeirão de corrupção, de prática de crimes, né? E nós não estamos, como disse o doutor Moro, criminalizando a política. O que nós estamos fazendo é combater criminosos que se escondem atrás dos mandatos políticos.
We have one more person. Go ahead, Iván. You want to respond? Go ahead.
Sí, solo decir tal vez que no se le puede dar tanta importancia en la transformación del país a la solución judicial. La solución judicial, naturalmente, que da un aporte muy importante, pero la transformación del país, el fortalecimiento del Estado de Derecho, creo que pasa por otras dos situaciones diferentes. De un lado, una profunda reforma del sistema electoral, de mecanismos de participación ciudadana, del control del dinero vinculado a la política. Se puede condenar centenares de personas que afecten ese juego democrático legal, pero si no hay una transformación en el sistema de participación electoral democrática, creo que sería muy difícil. Y de otro lado, muy vinculado con esto también los mecanismos de participación ciudadana. Creo que mientras más ciudadanía esté incorporada a estos procesos, acompañando la justicia, pero también buscando sus cauces de intervención en lo público, sería mucho más factible que esto no fuera simplemente un movimiento temporal, sino que propiciara la transformación real de nuestras democracias. Y finalmente, reformas en el funcionamiento del Estado, algo que se ha reclamado bastante en Guatemala. 50 años tiene la Ley de Servicio Civil en Guatemala y lo que ha mostrado es cómo se propicia para la corrupción la necesidad de crear una burocracia estatal permanente con idoneidad, con capacidad, con honorabilidad. Esas son transformaciones que se hacen también desde lo político en la administración del Estado y no desde lo judicial.
Let me go to part of your question, which is basically what about civil society in these processes. Civil society is always important, but it's even more important in the face of these corruption scandals, because essentially the politicians that can lead these reform processes are particularly weakened at that point. But for civil society to play its role, it needs not only to be scandalized, which is the case in the region now, and we've talked a lot about it, but it also needs information on the more nitty-gritty about the reforms that are important. And in that role, providing that information in a simple and accessible way by credible sources is a central role for civil society in terms of informing the public so they can put pressure to have reforms go in the right direction, and also validate those political actors which are leading or are prepared to lead those reforms. It is very difficult for political actors to lead these reforms. It's very difficult because they're going against their own establishment, against their own political parties often, and having this implicit alliance with organizations in civil society which validate these leaderships in moments where people don't trust anybody can be really crucial in pushing these agendas forward, and therefore change the way we finance politics, our lobbies laws, our conflict of interest laws, the way the judicial system works, and make it in that way less likely for these scandals to repeat in the future.
So Eduardo brought us very adeptly to the subject of our next panel, which is where do we go from here? How does this movement grow and sustain itself and continue? And while we've reached the end of our time here for this panel, we're going to a coffee break, but I want you please to join me in thanking all of them for their time.